If you have coffee running constantly through your veins and prefer books over people, then you are in the right place. Welcome to Have You Read This, a podcast for readers and bookworms. I now turn it over to your host, someone who thinks he is funnier than he actually is, Jason Morrison.
If you're like me and you have trouble going to bed at night and you're unable to shut your brain off, I can't recommend reading enough. But I'm also assuming that if you're listening to a podcast about books, you're probably already reading at night. So I don't know, maybe you need drugs. My nighttime routine is shifted to putting my phone on Do Not Disturb, and then I like to read until my eyes get so heavy that it's hard to keep them open. And I'm really not a huge fan of it being quiet when I go to sleep, and I need some type of noise, but I don't want a movie playing in the background. It has to be certain type of music, something calming. And what I've been doing is I started listening to audiobooks, and I've been using an app called Libby, which is connected to my public library. And I set a sleep timer, I close my eyes, and I listen until I am knocked out. Of course, the next time I open the audiobook, I have to rewind a little bit because I've got to get back to where I was before I fell asleep. And there was one night, where I set the sleep timer for, I set it for an hour. And my wife was like, I don't know why you set it for an hour. It needs to be like 10 minutes. And when I opened the audiobook, I thought, I have no idea what is happening right now. So I had to go back to the beginning of the chapter that I started just to figure out where I was. But it has been great listening to books at night, and it's helped me relax. It's helped me fall asleep. And there's a few occasions where I'll listen to them during the day while I work, but that's not always easy for me because I have a hard time concentrating on the work that I'm doing while I'm listening to an audiobook. So I usually just put on music. I have listened to quite a few audiobooks this past year. Some were awesome, and some there was one that actually sounded like it was narrated by a microwave. It was terrible. But I don't want to use the time here to bash any book or project, so I'm only going to focus on the good stuff. For those of you who have asked me if I'm only going to talk about dark reads, then this is the episode for you, because there is such a good variety of books, audiobooks that I've listened to, and these are not all just dark reads. The first one that I want to recommend is Sandy Hook by Elizabeth Williamson. I went into this with a Columbine mindset. Even though I read the synopsis, I somehow honestly just blanked over it. And I was expecting this massive investigation and insight into what happened at Sandy Hook. And I guess it still was that. It's just through a slightly different lens. Elizabeth Williamson was said to have spent hundreds of hours researching and interviewing those involved with Sandy Hook and to put this book together. And I've even found several mentions online where people refer to her as an expert on the topic. But this book covers probably more what happened after Sandy Hook, not necessarily before. It does not delve too far into the mind of the person responsible or the circumstances surrounding it. At least not like Dave Cullen's Columbine book did. However, it does take a deep dive into the aftermath. Specifically, it covers how parents of murdered children had to defend themselves against conspiracy theorists. You want to find out just how insane people can be? This book is a great start. There is a ton of content about Alex Jones and InfoWars, most of which was relatively new to me, as I had never really bothered to learn anything about him. And honestly, this book was enough for me when it comes to that guy and any of his supporters. This audiobook was great for two reasons. First, the information was incredible and presented so well. Second, the narration was perfect. The book was narrated by Rebecca Lohman and Elizabeth Williamson, and it was read with I would say, a concern and a seriousness that was warranted by the topic. Not a single thing I would change about how this audiobook was put together. Next up, Soundtracks, The Surprising Solution to Overthinking by Jon Acuff. I've always enjoyed anything that this guy puts out. His blog was what turned me into a reader. And the coolest thing recently was this totally random encounter we had at Dollywood where we bumped into him and got to talk with him. We were in Tennessee and we were helping a group of adults with disabilities go and have a blast at Dollywood. And I remember walking, and I think Jon Acuff has like a unique look. And I remember it totally caught me off guard. I was just walking along Dollywood, and he's the last person that I expected to see or recognize. And I look over and I saw him, and I turned to my wife and I was like, "Hey, check that guy out over there." And she was like, "That's Jon Acuff." And what really surprised me was, like, we were with this group, so we really couldn't leave or detach from them, I should say. And it surprised me because she all of a sudden's like, "Hey, Jon Acuff." And he just stopped what he was doing, raised his hand and smiled and waved back. I thought it was a really cool encounter. And we saw him later on, and my wife was like, "All right, I'm gonna go get a selfie." And we went over there, we talked to him. Just a great dude. And he's someone that should be on your radar for sure. And Soundtracks, his book, he claims to have created a proven plan to help you change overthinking and transition that from what he calls a super problem into a superpower. This is a very practical book, and it has very clear goals and steps. It's not overcomplicated, but the content can be put into practice by anyone. And I think the best thing about all of this is that he narrates his book himself. Now, because of how charismatic he is, this doesn't actually come across like someone reading you a term paper. It comes across like him sitting at a table with you and walking you through his process, while also tossing in his sense of humor, which is great. I haven't looked at everything, but if he narrates all of his audiobooks, I'm going to have to go back and listen to every single one, including the books that I've already read by him. Next up, Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. Ike Randolph is an ex-con who has been out of jail for 15 years. Buddy Lee is another ex-con with a checkered past. Ike, who is a black man, has a son named Isaiah. Buddy Lee, a white man, had a son named Derek. And it turns out Isaiah and Derek were in a relationship, and they were also murdered. This book is just all kinds of fantastic, mainly because of all of the issues that it deals with all at once. First, the overall story is just great to me. Cosby is just one hell of an amazing writer. And when we heard him speak at a local book social, I was hooked right away. He only read a short story to us because he didn't have a lot of time, but really that's all it took. Some authors are just extremely talented at also reading their material to a group, not just writing it, but being able to put raw emotion into it. Razorblade Tears is a story about how Ike and Buddy Lee come together to track down the killers of their sons, but they also have to address a lot of crap from the past, a lot of these painful issues, prejudices, things they regret, conversations they had, conversations they didn't had. It's all excellent the way Cosby put this together. This book was narrated by Adam Lazar White. I'm now convinced that this dude could read just about anything and I would want to listen. It's an example of a perfect pairing. His voice with Cosby's writing. I can't say enough positive things about it. He's so good that he could probably read Lady Gaga lyrics and make them sound worth hearing. The next book is Where All Light Tends to Go by David Joy. This story centers around Jacob McNeely, whose father runs a meth ring in the mountains of North Carolina. He's eventually faced with this decision to leave his father and his home or to run off with Maggie, who was his first love. While that might seem like a simple and boring story to some, David Joy works all kind of writing magic here. I could feel the sadness, I could feel frustration, anger, despair. I could feel all of these emotions with these characters. David Joy was another author we had the chance to hear read some of his work out loud at a recent book social. He had me hooked immediately also because when he walked up to speak, he told the crowd that he doesn't write anything short and that it was already past his bedtime. And I kind of felt like we could be friends only because of that. And it's difficult to explain, but the way that he spoke, that was such a powerful moment. He knew the pacing. He knew where to place the emphasis on certain parts of the story. And after hearing him read a chapter of one of his books, I went back to Goodreads and put everything he had written on my TBR. Now, this book was narrated by MacLeod Andrews, and I have to imagine the four people that listen to this are so excited about hearing me talk about books and struggle over names. I'm sorry, bro. I can't pronounce your name. Much like Razorblade Tears, this was a perfect match. And you would have thought that the guy was actually Jacob McNeely at times. I forgot that this was a story written by somebody else that actually sounded like the person telling me the story. Just an amazing voice. Again, perfect pacing, perfect emphasis, and all around presentation. Rather than my typical, you may like these books based on what I just talked about, I'm going to toss in a couple of audiobooks that I enjoyed that I think would be worth mentioning here in like the honorable mentions section. The first would be Unmasked: My Life Solving America's Cold Cases by Paul Holes. This is a memoir from the detective who is said to have located the Golden State Killer. If you're a true crime buff, this would be a great book to read. Holes goes into great detail about his life as a detective, the toll it took on him in his personal life, as well as several other cold cases that he helped work. Holes narrates this book himself, and he actually has the perfect voice for reading this type of material. True crime fits him very well. Of course, I think it would also be pretty awesome to hear this guy read a children's book, or maybe that would be too frightening, or maybe it would be frighteningly awesome if that's a thing. The next one I wanted to mention is Calypso by David Sedaris. And this one reads that with Calypso, he sets his formidable powers of observation toward middle age and mortality. These stories are very, very funny. It's a book that can make you laugh till you snort, the way only family can. Even with my age and declining memory, I don't remember snorting a single time while reading this book. And I don't know of a snort that's specific to a family the way only a family can snort. Anyway, but it was funny. It certainly had its funny moments. He narrates his book himself, and he does an excellent job at it. Some of these authors, I'll tell you, some of them should never read their work, and some of them should be the ones to narrate it because they're so good. And this is another example of it. The combination of his ability as a writer, along with narrating his own material, that alone, I think, makes this worth listening to. And finally, the book probably nobody thought I would ever listen to, The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. Do I really need to say, do I need to say anything else other than that? I'm told by a friend of mine, Justin here in Louisville, he actually has a small shrine to Britney Spears in one of his kitchen cabinets, ironically. It's dedicated solely to Britney. And he told me once that on Halloween, he likes to dress up as her, but he doesn't go out trick-or-treating. Anyway, the book is a memoir, obviously, and the synopsis states, The Woman in Me is a brave and astonishingly moving story about freedom, fame, motherhood, survival, faith, and hope. Only the introduction of the book is narrated by Spears, which was kind of a letdown, if I'm being honest. I can in no way, shape, or form imagine what it would be like living her life, and I certainly can't judge her for anything. A glimpse into her world was certainly interesting and at times a little mind-blowing, and I can see why there was so much hatred toward old Justin Timberlake and why he had to end up turning his comments off on Instagram. But the narrator here, Michelle Williams, I think she did a great job. I don't want to bash her at all. I just felt like this memoir would have been even more powerful if Brittany had spoken the words she wrote and not had someone else do it. And here's a fun fact. Did you know that her book also has an accompanying workbook that's titled Workbook for the Woman in Me by Britney Spears, a guide to discovering yourself? Yeah. I didn't know that either. And after listening to the audiobook, I can't imagine wanting to go through it with a workbook to discover myself. But my friend Justin probably already owns that. And I guess, to each his own. Well, that's about it for this episode. If you have an audiobook that you think was awesome, hit me up on Instagram or TikTok. Right now, I'm listening to the Murderbot Diary series, which I think is pretty cool, and it's a break from what I normally would read. But I'm always up for suggestions. And right after you hit stop or pause or whatever you do on this episode, I want you to go over to haveyoureadthispodcast.com and drop in your email. It's free, and I'm sending out episode updates as well as other articles about books that you probably should have already read by now. And I've been toying around with doing some type of giveaway, but not stupid influencer sponsored ad giveaway. I'd like to make this meaningful and unique and purposeful for people that actually enjoy books. The only way to get that is to drop your email in. I promise I don't send out spam. Until next time.